I recently had a paper published in the World Review of Political Economy, and the title is Why China's Capital Exports Can Weaken Imperialism. And the reason I chose this title is because it's counter to the dominant impression of imperialism. People think of imperialism as the export of capital, and that's because of definitions that we've inherited from John Hobson and also Vladimir Lenin. So I actually argue that it's the other way around. The Chinese capital exports weaken imperialism, and I go through deductively about how you can come to this conclusion about what imperialism is. China today is the leading capital exporter in the world. China in 1999 virtually exported no capital. But then throughout the 2000s, it started to export more and more capital to the point where from 2015 onwards, China became the leading capital exporter, not Japan. And it's just a fact. I mean, that Sub-Saharan Africa today is the second fastest growing region of the world, and that's largely because of investments that have come from China. There's also technology that's being transferred from China, and the value of China's overseas investments in construction combined since 2005. This goes to my thesis question, which is, what are the insights of Indian political economy that are of relevance for reconceptualizing the term imperialism into an explanatory theoretical model capable of explaining both war and national exploitation throughout history. And so it was through looking at the contributions of Indian political economy, beginning with non-Marxists like Dadabhai Naoroji here and R.C. Dutt, whose work was then, picked up by Indian Marxists after them. So the very reference to Indian political economy I got from E.M.S. Namboodiripad. He was the first chief minister of Kerala under the undivided Communist Party of India. And these are some contemporary Marxists, highly respected in India: Irfan Habib, Utsa Patnaik, Prabhat Patnaik. And I owe a lot of my theoretical arguments from work that these two, the Patnaiks, have done. Here's my argument. So I basically say, look, you can divide the discourse about imperialism into two initial categories. That's the blue and the red. The first generation of people who wrote about imperialism, that is the people who originally popularized the term in Marxist discourse, were Hobson, Lenin, Luxemburg, and Kautsky. Now, Hobson wasn't a Marxist, he was a social liberal, but his conception of imperialism was integrated into Marxism by Lenin. Now, what I found is that they sought to explain warfare because they're writing in the context of World War I. So that's their intention. They want to explain why these various empires are headed towards war with each other. That's what they want to do. They want to explain this tendency towards warfare. In Hobson's era, because he wrote earlier than Lenin, it was the war in South Africa, so the British invasion of the Boer republics of South Africa. So Hobson was like looking at that war and he was saying, look, we are heading towards a situation of like war between empires, especially if this continues. The problem is that although this blue category, the original theorists, although they sought to explain warfare, in their theoretical model, I maintain that there was no space for national exploitation. There was no theoretical room for national exploitation. However, in 1920, Lenin redefined imperialism as national exploitation. So you have a contradiction within Lenin. Lenin in 1916, the model of imperialism that he presents has no theoretical room for national exploitation. That's my claim. But in 1920, he explicitly redefines imperialism as national exploitation. So what do we take? Do we take the definition from 1920 or from 1916? Well, if you want to be true to Lenin, then what somebody says in their later life supersedes what they said in their earlier life. So after the original theorists, then you have the world systems analysis, and they came after the Second World War. So that's people like Andre Gundafrank, Emmanuel Wallerstein, Giovanni Arrighi, Harry Magdoff, Samir Amin, Paul Barron, and Paul Sweezy. Now, they sought to explain national exploitation. That's what they wanted to do. However, they didn't really try and explain warfare. That wasn't their priority, because these people, they're trying to aid the development of the post-colonial world. They're trying to say, this is what you have to do. You have to use your foreign exchange reserves in a sparing manner. You should ensure that you use them to import the machine tools and the capital equipment that you need to substitute the imports of high value added goods. So that's import substitution industrialization. It's a theory of how post-colonial nations and poor countries can develop. Indian political economy, I think, can help bridge this gap. And that's why I've included this symbol of a yin-yang, right? Imperialism has to do both. Imperialism as a theory It has to explain how the peacetime systems of national exploitation develops tendencies towards warfare. So what I'm taking from the original theorists is the attempt to explain warfare. What I'm taking from the world systems analysts, is the explanation of national exploitation. So we're trying to do both. We have to explain national exploitation and warfare. And I think Indian political economy offers many very important insights that help to bridge this gap. That's the argument that I'm making. So what did Lenin mean by imperialism? This is what I'm saying. There are two different Lenins, and we have to recognize this. The Lenin of 1916, he was addressing the communists in the advanced countries, okay? It's at the very beginning of that text. He says, this is for the communists in the advanced capitalist countries. He was not addressing the people of India. He wasn't addressing the people of China. The reason he was addressing the communists in the advanced capitalist countries is because it's the working classes of these advanced capitalist countries that are primarily involved in fighting this war. And so Lenin and Luxemburg, what they were saying around this time is we have to turn the war between nations into a war between classes. That's the Lenin of 1916. Then in 1920 at the Comintern, so this is after the First World War, and so Lenin redefines imperialism in these terms. He says, the characteristic feature of imperialism consists in the whole world being divided into oppressed nations and oppressor nations, and about 70% of the world's population belong to the oppressed nations. That is clearly a reference to the 70% of the world's population who either lived in post-colonial nations like in Latin America, or they lived in extractive colonies like in the West Indies, India, Malaya, Ghana in Africa, and the other kind of West African countries that were under the control of the French, or they lived in subjugated peripheries like China. So these are the oppressed nations for Lenin. The fact that he says 70% can only mean those countries. It's the tricontinent, Asia, Africa, Latin America. That's what Lenin's talking about. Now, this is my argument about why Lenin's 1916 definition of imperialism has no theoretical room for national exploitation. Lenin says that the motivation behind exporting capital was because in backward countries, profits are usually high, for capital is scarce, the price of land is relatively low, wages are low, raw materials are cheap. That's the motivation for why capitalists in the advanced countries or the imperialist countries would want to export capital. Then Lenin says the export of capital influences and greatly accelerates the development of capitalism in those countries to which it is exported, and that it may tend to a certain extent to arrest development in the capital exporting countries. Now, here's my argument. If this is the economic mechanism underpinning imperialism, then it implicitly rules out even the possibility of national exploitation, given that backward countries, in quotes, are being spurred into industrial development by externally originating capital, which is also at the economic expense of the imperial power. So this does not explain India's situation. Did Britain export capital to India, which then accelerated the development of capitalism in India? No, the opposite happened. India deindustrialized under Britain. India was robbed of its capital. Britain was then exporting that capital to countries like Australia, the United States, Canada, Argentina, New Zealand. So these countries were the beneficiaries of capital exports from Britain. But the reason why Britain could export that capital to begin with is because it had a large colonized, extractive periphery comprised of nations that were included in the sense that their wealth was included into the British Empire, but they themselves were excluded from the benefits of the development that comes from that wealth. This is Lenin's idea of inter-imperialism in World War I. Let's just say you've got two sides in World War I to simplify it, the Allied powers and the Central powers. They both have capitalist classes. They both have working classes. Lenin is basically saying instead of the working classes on both sides turning their guns on each other and then shooting each other and killing each other and dying in the trenches for their respective capitalist classes, why don't the workers on both sides overthrow their capitalist ruling classes? And that way you can kill two birds with one stone. You can end the war, that's number one, and two, you can have socialism. My argument is that the arguments that he made about the export of capital, it implicitly rules out national exploitation, because the argument that Lenin is making is that imperialism is bad for the working classes in the imperialist countries. He's saying the reason why your ruling classes are going to war overseas is because they need to seize control of territories around the world so they can export capital to those territories. And the reason they need to export capital is because they don't want to raise your wages. They don't want to invest domestically at home because they know that profits are going to be lower. And this is a debate that you see coming up, so whenever people say, oh, Lenin's not relevant to what's happening now, I mean, this is part of the reason why Donald Trump got elected. You had people in the United States saying, we don't like the fact that our ruling classes are exporting capital to China and to all of these other countries. We would much rather that the US capitalist class invest domestically in the American economy. But the reason they won't do that is because they don't want to pay Americans decent wages. They'd much rather. And so there's a direct parallel between the type of people that Lenin is appealing to in his 1916 text and the type of people that voted for Donald Trump. We have to recognize that these parallels exist, because that way you can actually go to like a Trump voter and you can say, well, there's incredible parallels between what Lenin was saying and the reason why you voted for Donald Trump, right? Now, this is not an endorsement of Donald Trump. My argument, I mean, I'm sure, Dust, you agree with this, right? Like, the people you have to win over are the people who voted for Trump, right? Because they are the people who suffered from deindustrialization. Moving on. The study of warfare, that is asking the question, what are the original causes of war? It's a very old tradition in the study of history, and it goes back to Thucydides, or Thucydides as they pronounce it in Greek. And he said it was the rise of Athens and the fear this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. And today we find ourselves in a situation where it's the rise of China and the fear that this instills in the United States, that some say, people like the Hawks in particular, they say, oh, war is absolutely inevitable because China is a rising power. Capitalism versus imperialism. This is something that a lot of Marxists struggle with. So one question that I often ask Marxists who disagree with my conceptualization of imperialism, I ask them the question, what's the difference between capitalism and imperialism? And a lot of them, if they've read Lenin, they will say that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. I disagree with this. Okay, if you take Lenin's 1920 definition of imperialism as national exploitation, then imperialism cannot be a stage of human history. So first you have the capitalist stage of human history, then you have the imperialist stage of human history, or rather, imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. So you have the capitalist stage, and then imperialism is the highest stage. And this stage is when revolution is imminent. That's the way that Lenin used it. And it's understandable in Lenin's context, right? He is trying to get the workers of Europe to turn the war between nations into a war between classes. That is his objective. It's a noble objective, and we honor him for that. My argument is that capitalism and imperialism, it's like an intersection. Imperialism is national exploitation. Capitalism is class exploitation. It's very, very simple. On the left-hand side, this is the conception of capitalism that we know and understand. At the very top, you've got the capitalist class. They're the exploiting class. And underneath, you've got the exploited classes, the workers and the peasants who have nothing to lose but their chains, according to Marx. Imperialism is when you take this pyramid of capitalists and workers, and that now becomes the exploiting nation. So now you have this interesting dichotomy. You have the exploiting class of the exploiting nation. You have the exploited class of the exploiting nation. You then have the exploiting class of the exploited nation. And then you have the exploited class of the exploited nation. So now this is when we start to really get serious, right? So British imperialism. Britain is important in the Marxist understanding of history, because Britain is the first capitalist country. Britain is also the first imperialist country. Britain would extract goods and capital from the extractive periphery, and they would then export goods and capital to their mercantile rivals, so that's countries like the United States, Germany, France. And then these mercantile rivals would export finished goods back to Britain. So you have pretty even trade going on here between the hegemon and the mercantile rivals. It's mutually beneficial. Britain exports capital. Britain gets a return on that capital. With that capital, the mercantile rivals are able to industrially develop and then export finished goods back to Britain. Now, what happens is that over time, Britain starts to deindustrialize as the hegemon relative to the mercantile rivals. Okay? And so the mercantile rivals are industrializing, Britain is deindustrializing. And all Britain has to export is money, right? Is paper banknotes that are allegedly backed by gold. Now, that entire game falls apart after the First World War because Britain can no longer sustain a gold standard. And so in 1931, they end convertibility of their currency to gold. Okay. And the reason that was happening is because they could no longer extract, they needed more and more goods and capital. They needed to squeeze the Indians and the Chinese and the Africans for more and more wealth in order to balance their trade deficits with the mercantile rivals. Okay. And that's what I argue. These are the economic conditions that create the underlying conditions for war between the hegemon and the mercantile rivals. Now, obviously, Britain is going to find it easier to fight Germany than they are to fight the United States. I mean, the United States is separated by the Atlantic. Britain's already been bruised by trying to resubjugate the United States. I think the reason why they call it the White House is because, the British burnt it down and they bleached it white or something like that. And so, yeah, this is like what leads to the contradictions of World War One. Hegemon rival contradictions is what I call them. It's also important to remember here, M.N. Roy was an Indian Marxist. He was very close to Lenin, Stalin. He didn't like Trotsky very much. He wrote in his memoirs, he was writing about his interactions with a lot of these old Bolsheviks. And he said that a lot of Bolsheviks were of the opinion that the next major conflict is going to be between Britain and the United States. And so M.N. Roy chimes in, he says, no, that's not going to happen. If anything, the United States is going to inherit hegemony from Britain, and they're going to be on the same team, and they are going to try and limit the growth of European powers, right? So countries like Germany in particular.
I thought it was interesting. So you're not dismissing the 1916 theory of imperialism. You're taking a component of that and moving it into this period of imperialism, which is more deemed by, the exploitation of oppressed nations.
Correct. Yeah. So I'm saying that the 1916 definition of imperialism was relevant for Europeans. It was relevant for the countries of Europe that were at war with each other. Yep. That's what it was relevant for. And Lenin makes it clear that his text is for the communists of the advanced capitalist countries. Yes. But, the US, unlike Britain, does not have an extractive periphery. Now, Britain could very easily expropriate the tax revenues from India, could very easily force the Chinese to pay very large indemnity payments. They could expropriate slave rents from the West Indies, and they could expropriate the tax revenues of West Africa as well. And with all of this expropriated wealth, Britain could perform the role of the liberal free trade hegemon. So liberalism on one side of the world for the hegemon and the mercantile rivals, and basically colonial slavery for the people on the other side of the world. So it's like a lot of liberalism, like I say this to liberals, is like a lot of the liberal values that you take for granted and value and cherish are premised on Britain having a dominant role in world affairs and being able to enslave a very large percentage of the world's population. The United States does not have this advantage, right? The United States does not have a large extractive periphery. And part of the reason for that is because, yes, the United States has performed an anti-imperialist role throughout history. This is actually important to remember. So, for example, it's very easy to look at someone like, FDR, Roosevelt, and find reasons why he was evil from a generally left-wing point of view. But it is a fact that, Roosevelt, in his discussions with Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of Britain, demanded that Britain decolonize, that Britain let go of its enslaved extractive peripheries like India. Now, the reason that the United States gave was obviously very high-minded and liberal, but there is a logic to it for establishing US hegemony because it gets the British out of the way. It opens up these countries to the US dollar, and then undermines Britain in the process. And so this leads to a situation in which the United States subordinates Britain. So the United States goes from having a subordinate relationship to to Britain to having like the dominant like relationship in that kind. It's a brotherly relationship, you know. It's like, it's not like they're enemies, you know. They're basically still on the same team. It's just that after 1944, the United States is in charge. But for that brief period, like, you know, so 1944, 45, when Roosevelt was in charge, the United States did play an anti-imperialist role insofar as they demanded that Britain decolonize in exchange for the loans that Britain needed to get themselves through the Second World War. Yeah, sure. So I was going to say about William Jennings Bryan that the major part of his campaign was for bimetallism. He wanted to introduce a bimetallic standard so that, you know, silver would be upwardly valued against gold at a ratio of 16-1. So, you know, if you handed in, you know, 16 ounces of gold, you'd get 16 ounces of silver, you'd get 1 ounce of gold. This also, I argue in my thesis, was objectively anti-imperialist. And the reason is because the way that that British hegemony functioned was by a system that I call bimetallic apartheid. So going back to the previous slide, the way that bimetallic apartheid works is that the extractive peripheries, they produce and their wealth is extracted in silver. But then Britain, the British currency is in gold. You know, so India, for example, had to pay its taxes in silver, but then Britain charged India in British pounds, which is a gold standard. So that means that Britain had an interest in the devaluation of silver against gold, which is what happened. So from 1870 onwards, the market value of silver went from around 15.5 to 1, because that's France used to maintain a bimetallic standard, right? But it went from around 15.5 to 1 to about 30 to 1. And a major reason for this is because of the fact of the drain, like the fact that Britain was draining its extractive colonies and that these extractive colonies ran on silver, which means that countries around the world would dump their silver on the extractive peripheries, right? Because they wanted to escape the depreciation risk that comes with the value of silver falling relative to gold. So in this context, for William Jennings Bryan to say we should remonetize silver again and like bring back value to silver, that would have objectively weakened the drain of wealth from India to Britain, right? If that had succeeded. And what happened in that campaign, right? I mean, William Jennings Bryan was outspent by a factor of 9 to 1 by the McKinley campaign. So his opponent was very close to the banks in New York, who were very close to the banks in London. And I think they understood. They said, look, we have to defeat this guy. He's extremely charismatic. He's popular, especially in the parts of the United States that are neglected by industrialization, the more agrarian parts of the United States. And he can win. And so they outspent him 9 to 1. Because I believe that they knew that the hegemony of the British Empire relied on this system of bimetallic apartheid. You're right. I mean, the United States has to deal with the periphery on quid pro quo terms, which means that because the United States does not have the ability to simply drain wealth from the periphery, if they want goods from the periphery, they have to give them US dollars. And it's the same with the mercantile rivals as well. If they want, like, more advanced industrial goods from the mercantile rivals, they have to give them US dollars. And so the United States, especially after 1971, goes on a printing spree. The United States just prints lots and lots of money, and countries around the world, they accept US dollars because the US dollar is what guarantees all of these countries around the world, alienated on their own, to be able to access the resources that they need from around the world, right? So it's like, it's the common currency, it's the language, the lingua franca of commerce is the US dollar. That's when they introduced the petrodollar, which is the basic idea is that the OPEC countries, the oil producing countries, they price their oil in dollars, in US dollars, which means that countries around the world, if they want to import oil, they have to ask the question, what should our exchange rate be with the US dollar? And so they have to maintain that exchange rate, because if they don't, they experience inflation. So simply by being the only country in the world that is able to just print money like mad without experiencing inflation, the United States does get a free lunch from the rest of the world. Now, it gets a free lunch from the mercantile rivals, but the thing is, the mercantile rivals are exporting industrial goods. Think about countries like Japan. Think about the East Asian economies, right? They produce advanced goods. But the United States is still getting a free lunch from them because these countries actually do have to go through, technologically advanced production processes to churn out these high value exports like, smartphones and things like that in exchange for the US dollar, whereas the US just has to print the money. That's it. Which is why, we are in like an unprecedented era now, right? Because this year has been unprecedented in the history of US inflation. Inflation has never been higher. I'd say that a lot of the labor unrest in the United States is because people realize that their pay packets are being smashed by inflation. And so the US is now running into very serious problems. In the past, they were able to export inflation to other countries because other countries needed the US dollar. But as these mercantile rivals start to grow in strength, as they start to match the technological parity of the United States, then the need for the US dollar starts to diminish. And that's a problem for the US. So the United States would much rather that China invest their capital surpluses in US dollar denominated assets rather than export that capital to the periphery directly. So the people who are saying that China exporting capital to the periphery, that this is imperialist, China exporting capital to the periphery, people who say that this relationship is imperialist are ignoring the fact that the pre-existing hegemonic US imperialist arrangement was for China to export its capital to the United States, which then props up the value of the US dollar. Now, this creates a dilemma for the United States because if the US is hostile to China, as they have been ever since Xi Jinping came to power, if they're hostile to China, then China has a very important lever, which is that it can sell off its US dollars and buy something else. In fact, that's what they've done. So they used to hold something like 65% of their foreign exchange reserves in US dollars. And since then, it's fallen to under 50. I don't remember the exact figures, but it's in my thesis. That's the thing. I mean, that's basically the argument. I mean, although I didn't talk mainly about China, if we're talking about Chinese capital exports are weakening the hegemony of the US dollar and therefore weakening US imperialism. The relationship that China has with the periphery, with the post-colonial world, is similar to the relationship that the hegemon Britain had with the mercantile rivals. When Britain exported capital to Australia, it resulted in even development between Australia and Britain. Australians ended up with the exception of Aboriginal people who were largely excluded for many decades, and still are excluded, so I'm not denying that. But Australians, on average, were able to experience similar living standards to people in Britain because of the export of capital from Britain to Australia. Well, now China is exporting capital to Africa and all these other countries, right? So China is actually treating these countries the way that Britain treated Australia economically, not the way that Britain treated India. Because actually India exported capital to Britain, but it would be absurd to say that India was the imperialist power in that relationship. This slide is important because you know how I was previously mentioning that like after the US established their currency as the hegemonic currency, they actually developed an interest in maintaining the core periphery relations across the world that they'd inherited from Britain. So this is a direct quote from George Kennan. I mean, he was one of the architects of the US post-war order. And he said, "We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern," that should be two, devise a pattern to maintain this position of disparity. This quote summarizes US imperialism. Maintain disparity across the world because the United States can accommodate a few countries that are allowed to become wealthy, but it can't accommodate the entire world to become as wealthy as the United States. It can accommodate NATO, Western Europe, Japan, but can it accommodate Russia and China? No. The United States therefore tried to contain the development of the Soviet Union. Then they started to invest in China, which raises a question, why did they start investing in China to begin with, right? And the reason the US did this, and it was a mutually beneficial relationship between China and the United States, was simply because after they ended the convertibility of their currency to gold, there was inflation in the US dollar. And so the way that they dealt with that inflation was to go to the Chinese and say, will you produce in exchange for US dollars? And this over time resulted in the inflation in the US dollar falling, because the Chinese were working. They were working for those dollars and churning out goods that could be exchanged for those dollars, and therefore countries around the world had a renewed incentive to hold US dollars. But eventually China develops, because I think the United States, there was maybe a kind of racism. They thought, the Chinese, they're only ever going to make shoes and t-shirts for us. They're not going to develop beyond that. They're not going to develop smartphones that are like as good as the smartphones we have, right? But then eventually they did. So eventually China caught up. And that's why they keep going on about China stealing technology and stuff like that. And there is some truth to it, but part of the reason is because in the Chinese system, because they are more collectivist in the way that they organize their economy, if there's an innovation that one private company comes up with in China, they are obliged to share that via the Communist Party with other companies across China and with the government as well. And so you end up with this very rapid diffusion of technology across China. And this is a situation of, as Marx said, there being a contradiction between the relations of production and the forces of production. This is Marx's argument. Capitalism prevents the advancement of the forces of production. The relations of production become a fetter on the forces of production. So in the United States, all of this private property that you have, right, might actually be hindering innovation. So instead of getting angry at the Chinese for having a collectivist attitude towards knowledge creation, and innovation, why not appreciate the fact that they have a more egalitarian system for diffusing knowledge gained by one sector to another sector? So instead of saying we should try and stop China from doing this, the real argument should be, well, why don't we make these same demands on our ruling class? Why don't we say to our ruling class, look, your private property rights are stifling innovation. Look at the medical system in the United States. I mean, you pay way more for drugs than countries around the world because you have to pay basically a rent to these big pharma giants, right? Because you can't have generics, right? Because, that's excluded because it's their private property, their intellectual property, to be able to extract rent from the American population for medicines that can be produced for $2 in the rest of the world, but are sold in the United States for $500 or something. I'm just making it up, but you live there. I mean, right? Maybe you'd like to comment on that. So, I was reading this book, by Iswar Prasad, and he's an economist at the Brookings Institute, and he wrote this book called The Dollar Trap. He basically says, it's striking that so far during 2019, amid all the trade wars, geopolitical tensions, and economic and political recriminations against the US, foreign central banks in aggregate have been net purchasers of US Treasury securities. He then says there's so much turmoil that countries around the world seem willing to pay this huge price in order to protect themselves. Right. So I say that, although Prasad does not acknowledge any causal relationship between the US financial system and US military power, he uses the phrase protection money in one of his speeches to refer to the purchase of US dollar assets. And I say that this is curious because protection money is a phrase that's often associated with extortion. It's a euphemism for extortion. So how does US imperialism function? Basically says to the rest of the world, give me money, or in other words, loan me money and we'll pay you back. But then if you pay them back, then that's going to cause inflation because America just keeps printing more and more money. So this is the heart of US imperialism, is it's the monetary system. I mean, China, we should actually be kind of using the example of China to say, look, they discipline their ruling class. We should be disciplining our ruling class the way that the Chinese do. Instead of getting mad at the Chinese for being more successful than us. There's a question for me, by the way. So it's from Luke Buckmaster. He says, Jay, is that how American MMT is supposed to work? The basic idea of MMT, as far as I understand it, is that the money system begins with taxation. So the purpose of the money supply is to match the production in the economy. So let's say that you produce 100 goods in 1 year, then you should have 100 pieces of paper circulating to match those goods. And the way to the part of the kind of function of taxation is to prevent inflation. So if you have like a gigantic buildup of US dollars in the hands of the rich in particular, then that can cause inflation, because what are the rich going to do? If they've got billions and billions of dollars, they need to store it in assets. They're going to buy up lots and lots of property. The property prices are going to go up. It's going to be unaffordable for a lot of people, which is like a situation that resonates with anyone who lives in Sydney. Sydney is a very expensive city. So MMT, back to that question, the way it's supposed to work is that, if you're going to print money, then you have to suck money out, right? Because it's by sucking money out that you're able to control inflation. And so if you're a socialist, then the way that you would kind of advocate for MMT is to say that, printing money is not necessarily the issue, right? Because that can actually have an egalitarian effect. You print money to pay higher wages, you print money to invest in productive industries, that also has a knock-on effect to the rest of the economy, and then mass incomes can rise. But then you have to also suck money out of the economy. MMT to me sounds like it's living off third world rents by inflating money. To a certain extent, that's true, because the United States is unique in the sense that it's able to print its imports, it's able to print money without experiencing inflation to anywhere near the degree that other countries would experience inflation if they printed as much of their own currency as the US Federal Reserve does of the US dollar. So that's certainly true. But as a concept, it can be egalitarian if you're saying that in order to control inflation, we have to take money from the rich. Now, instead of taking money from the rich, the kind of strategy that you're seeing in the United States now is to suppress the growth of other countries. So here's a quote from George Friedman. He wrote a book called The Next 100 Years, and he's associated with Stratfor. Stratfor is like it's been called the shadow CIA, so it's very close to the American, the deep state, as they call it. And he said the United States has no overriding interest in peace in Eurasia. The purpose of these conflicts is simply to block a power or destabilize the region, not to impose order. Mind you, he said this in 2009 on the eve of the immensely destructive Arab Spring wars, the wars in Libya, Syria, countries like this. And he says to maintain the Eurasian balance of power is and will remain the driving force of US foreign policy throughout the 21st century. So he's saying the US has no interest in stability in Eurasia. So the question, when you look at a conflict like Syria and you see Russia, China, Iran, and the United States are all involved on different sides. So you have Iran, Russia, and China supporting the Syrian government, the United States, opposing the Syrian government and also supporting the Kurds in northern Syria, because they're occupying northern Syria on behalf of the Kurds, and that's causing, it's causing serious economic problems in the rest of Syria. It's very easy to look at this and say, oh, look, there's multiple imperial powers, Russia, China, Iran. That's one block of imperial powers versus the United States and, Europe and Britain on the other side. And that's the other camp of imperialism. But then the question I would ask is, look, if imperialism, the original conception of the term, was intended to explain the causes of war, then the question we have to ask is, where's the aggression coming from? Where is the instability coming from? So the United States wants instability in the Middle East, and they've destroyed many lives to try and achieve that permanent state of instability. Whereas Russia and China, they want stability. They want to prevent US meddling in these regions, right? So I would say that the cause of war is actually coming from the United States. It's not coming from China. It's not coming from Russia. They may be involved. They may be exporting capital to Syria so that, Syria can develop its industry. I mean, how awful would that be if, Syrians are, developing, oh my God, that's imperialism, according to some people, right? But no, I mean, let's look at where the cause of the war is originally coming from. So that takes me to John Mearsheimer. He's an American geostrategic thinker, very well known. And he wrote an article recently, and I should have quoted something from the article. I only kind of got past the paywall and read it this morning. But this is from the Center for Independent Studies, which is a think tank here in Australia. And this is from their YouTube blurb about John Mearsheimer. But this basically sums it up. Once China grew wealthy, a US-China Cold War was inevitable. Had US policymakers understood this logic in the early 1990s, they would have tried to slow down Chinese growth and maximize the power gap between Beijing and Washington. So the strategy that the US has, if Trump's slogan was "Make America Great Again," The strategy of the Cold War against China is make China poor again. That's the strategy. And the reason the US is doing this is because there is not a serious threat to the financial power of the oligarchy in the United States. It's like, why rob China when you can just rob your own elites? Well, not rob. I mean, take back what's rightfully belongs to the masses of American people, right, and to the working class. If you do that, if you actually redistribute wealth from from the very top to the very bottom, then you wouldn't need to keep inflation under control by wanting to give China another century of humiliation. So that's the argument. That's why anti-imperialism actually benefits the American working class. So I disagree with anyone who says that the American working class just perpetually benefits from imperialism. There is some truth to that because of the free lunch from US dollar hegemony. That's all true. But the price that you pay for that US dollar hegemony is deindustrialization. It's the fact that all of your primary industries in the center of the country have been completely gutted and destroyed. And the only industries that you have are Silicon Valley and banking and high tech, which can only ever employ a smaller number of people. As compared to all of the industry that you used to have, which used to absorb a much larger percentage of the American workforce. And so people are losing their jobs. So you're paying for this hegemony through deindustrialization. And Donald Trump was smart enough to tap into that sentiment. And Marxists should be even more adept, even more savvy at tapping into that sentiment, right? And I'm happy to talk about Australia later if after a few questions or whatever. Australia has its political development has been sabotaged by US meddling. I mean, the Whitlam dismissal, Whitlam wanted to nationalize the mines, which at the time were valued at $5.2 trillion at that time in 1970s. So you can only imagine what they'd be valued today, and so US meddling got rid of him. US meddling also got rid of Kevin Rudd. And so, it's actually the US that's keeping Australia backwards. The other thing about Rudd is that, Rudd was actually quite useful to the United States after the global financial crisis because he spoke Mandarin and could directly communicate with the Chinese that the United States wanted them to buy all of this US debt, because the US is printing money for the banks, right? Because they had gone under, there was a massive write down of assets. And so to make up for all of those losses, the US started printing money. And so the Chinese stepped in and they lent money to the US. Now, the Russians at the same time were telling the Chinese to do the opposite. They were saying, well, you should do a very fast sale of all of your US assets, and that would crash the American economy even more, right? So the global financial crisis could have been even worse if it wasn't for the willingness of China to help the United States. And I think part of the reason why China went along with this is because, in those meetings where the only leader from the Anglo world that spoke Mandarin was Rudd, they saw Rudd as someone that they could trust. And so they cooperated with the plans of the West. So once China did that, once China, lent America all of this money and the American situation stabilized, then I think Rudd was no longer needed for the United States. And so they orchestrated a coup against him. And the other thing is that Rudd was undermining the profits of American companies. 80% of our, mining company profits goes overseas to the United States. He wanted to introduce a mining tax, which would have undermined that stream of revenue for American investors. Julia Gillard comes to power and then waters down that mining tax, which should have raised billions of dollars, right? It ended up raising a very small amount, a few $100 million extra. Wasn't much at all. So I really don't like Julia Gillard for that. And the other thing is, if you look at Australia's history, the reason I bring up this hegemon rival graph is because in many ways, Australia is more of an extractive periphery. I mean, we have some industry, and the reason we experience first world living standards like the mercantile rivals is because we're a small population sitting on top of a large mountain of natural resources. And so we can be an extractive periphery that spreads that wealth, relatively across, geographically across the population, so that people generally have first world living standards, right? But in many ways, if you look at Australia structurally in terms of its trade relations with other countries, we're more of an extractive periphery. So if the United States is the hegemon, so if we're going down here, if the United States is the hegemon, and Australia can function as an extractive periphery, and China is the leading mercantile rival, then I think, in many ways, Australia's like willingness to pump out like raw materials to China is what allows China to maintain faith in the US dollar. Does that make sense? So it's like the Chinese are like, okay, well, the reason why we'll hold US dollars is because the vassal state of the United States, called Australia, right, is willing to, export all of these raw materials to us, right? And the reason I bring this up is because it ties into something else that Luke Buckmaster is actually making some pretty cool comments. He goes, when China has political hegemony over Australia, how do we know they won't do to us what our British ancestors did to them? Can't help look at this through a Spenglerian lens. I too am a respecter of Oswald Spengler. Look, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, obviously, right? I mean, although we can kind of make predictions, I suspect that like the Chinese would be really, really mean to Australia if we do join in like US aggression against China, and then the US gets its ass kicked, and then China says, look, you have to pay us an indemnity in some kind of way. But I think like the real problem is internal to Australia. I don't think the Chinese would ever need to invade and conquer Australia in order to dominate it economically. No. All they'd have to do is pay bribes to corrupt politicians. That's all they'd have to do. And they'd have the water resources, they'd have the agricultural resources. And then, of course, people in Australia would blame Chinese imperialism when really, if it's possible for a country to take over your country through, quid pro quo, wheeling and dealing, without actually using any military force at all. But then, I think the real danger is if China becomes the hegemon, right? Which it's not now. China does not have the world hegemonic currency. If it does become the world's hegemon and has the hegemonic currency, and if it does start to deindustrialize the way that the United States has, and if as a result of this deindustrialization, China finds it hard to balance its trade deficits with other countries that have been stimulated into industrializing because of Chinese capital exports, if all of those conditions are met, then China will have the same interest in destabilizing other countries to prevent them from developing so that they can maintain their hegemony. Under those conditions, I can see the Chinese being as bad as the United States. But we're not at that stage of history. We're at the stage of history where the hegemon is bullying China, and we're joining in on the bullying, right? Which means that if China does defeat the United States, then, well, we've sided with the aggressor in the eyes of the Chinese. And that's a position that I would not want to be in. But we have to deal with what we see, and what we see is a China that's not aggressive, a China that's friendly with countries all over the world. I mean, it does have border disputes. I'm not denying that. It's got border disputes with India, which is a zero-sum conflict. It's got issues with Vietnam. All of that's true, but it's not actively underdeveloping or draining wealth from any other country, right? It's actually like exporting industrial development. So I don't see it today, but maybe in the future, who knows? The cycle of currency hegemony, like that I've observed, it operates in the following way. There's a hegemon which stimulates the development of its mercantile rivals, and the reason it can exercise hegemony in the first place is because of the wealth that it extracts from a periphery. Eventually, the mercantile rivals become strong enough to challenge the hegemon. These are hegemon-rival contradictions. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in today, with the United States as the preeminent hegemon and China as the upcoming mercantile rival. If we really want to oppose the upcoming war, we have to make suggestions. So one of the things that I've suggested is that because the US has dollar hegemony, that if, for example, a pro-working class populist political force were to take power in the United States, what they should say to the Chinese is, how many of your US dollars are you willing to destroy in exchange for what geostrategic concessions? So one concession could be that the United States leaves Eurasia, so leaves the Middle East, leaves the South China Sea. Maybe the United States can like hang around in Australia as like a purely defensive power or something like that. But in exchange, the Chinese will destroy a whole pile of US dollars, and that can keep inflation under control in the United States. And that way, you can avert the underlying, you're addressing the underlying kind of economic contradictions that are leading to war. Words are weapons. Like the word imperialism, unfortunately, is now being weaponized against China to justify war, when the original purpose of that term from Lenin was to oppose war. So are we with the literal words of Lenin, like, words like export of capital, or are we with the spirit of Lenin? And I say, on the anniversary of the great October Socialist Revolution, that we maintain the spirit of Lenin, and we stay true to the spirit of Lenin, rather than like a purely literal interpretation.